The mining colony on Epsilon Prime had been running smoothly for 3 years now, and nobody expected anything to go wrong on that quiet Thursday morning. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison was checking the weekly reports in the command center, while his partner, Lieutenant Amy Peterson, kept an eye on the sensor screens that showed everything happening around their small settlement. The colony had 247 people living there, and most of them were miners and engineers with their families, who had come out to this distant world to make a better life for themselves. Protecting all these civilians were just 32 naval personnel who had been stationed there to keep the peace and handle any small problems that might come up. Captain Helen Vance ran the garrison with the kind of steady hand that came from 15 years of frontier service, and she believed in keeping things organized and prepared even when nothing seemed threatening. She had kept Epsilon Prime safe through bad weather and equipment breakdowns, and even a few times when pirates had scanned their system, but always moved on to easier targets. Nobody in the settlement had any idea that something much worse was heading their way and that their peaceful lives were about to be shattered forever. The Zinthri Concordat controlled 200 star systems, and they had been watching humanity spread across space with growing worry. High Archon Krelvax had stood before their council and argued that humans were becoming too bold and needed to learn their place in the galaxy. He wanted to hit one human colony hard enough that Earth would understand the Concordat was not to be challenged and would accept whatever terms the Zinthri decided to offer. The council agreed and chose Epsilon Prime because it was far from Earth, and lightly defended, and would make a perfect example on the morning of June 14th in the year 2387. The long-range sensors at Epsilon Prime picked up 6 Zinthri warships appearing at the edge of their star system. Lieutenant Danny Cruz was monitoring the sensors, and he immediately called Captain Vance to report what he was seeing. Within minutes, the alarm was sounding through the whole colony, and civilians were being rushed to the underground shelters, while the garrison grabbed their weapons and moved to defensive positions around the settlement. The Zinthri ships came closer, and Captain Vance tried to contact them but received no answer at all. Commander Greg Phillips, who was the chief engineer, started working to boost power to their shield generators, but everyone knew that the colony defenses had been built to scare off small pirate ships and not to fight a real military fleet. Captain Vance sent out an emergency signal toward Earth, even though she knew it would take 3 weeks for any help to arrive. And by then, everything would be decided one way or another. The attack started without any warning at all, and plasma torpedoes slammed into the shield dome, making it light up bright blue before sections began to fail and collapse. Lieutenant Amy Peterson was running the defensive batteries, and her gunners were firing back as fast as they could, but their weapons barely scratched the Zinthri ships. Jake Morrison fought with his security team on the eastern side of the settlement. As enemy soldiers began landing in drop ships and advancing through the streets, the battle went on for 4 terrible hours, and the garrison fought for every meter of ground. Captain Helen Vance died in the command center, still giving orders, and her last transmission included everything she had learned about the enemy forces and their tactics. Lieutenant Danny Cruz was killed while helping families get to deeper shelter levels where they might be safer. Commander Greg Phillips made the choice to overload the reactor core, and the explosion took out 2 Zinthri landing craft and gave the remaining defenders a few more precious minutes. When the guns finally stopped firing, only 63 humans were still alive out of the 279 who had been in the colony that morning. Jake Morrison had taken several bad hits, but he was the highest-ranking person left alive. The Zinthri commander, whose name was Subarchon Threncall, broadcast a message saying that Epsilon Prime now belonged to the Concordat, and he ordered all the survivors to gather in the center of what was left of the settlement. He left some of his own troops behind to hold the colony and make sure the humans understood they had been conquered. While Zinthri soldiers were securing the ruins, Amy Peterson was working quietly in what remained of the communications center. Her hands were shaking, and she was using damaged equipment, but somehow she managed to boost the distress signal that Captain Vance had sent. She added new footage showing what had really happened during the attack, and she made sure it would broadcast on every emergency channel before the enemy could detect what she was doing. When the Zinthari finally noticed and shut down the transmission it had already been sending for almost an hour. The message traveled through space for 3 weeks before it reached Earth, and what the Zinthari thought would be a simple demonstration of their power became something very different. The footage showed Captain Vance fighting to the end and civilians being killed and the colony burning, and when people across all the human worlds saw these images, something changed. Humanity had been peaceful and focused on exploration for a long time, but humans had not forgotten how to fight, and how to respond when their own people were murdered. The images from Epsilon Prime were broadcast everywhere, and people watched them in silence with growing anger. The Zinthari had thought they were teaching humans a lesson about power and their place in the galaxy, but instead they had awakened something that had been sleeping. Earth and all the colony worlds began to move and prepare, and the message they were preparing to send back to the Zinthari would be written in fire and steal across the stars themselves. Admiral Patrick Kelly was watching fleet exercises near Mars when the distress signal from Epsilon Prime finally reached him, and he sat in silence viewing the footage 3 times before he said a single word. He was a 40-year veteran with gray hair and the bearing of someone who had spent his whole life in military service, and he knew immediately that everything was about to change. He made one call to Fleet Command on Earth and another to every admiral commanding ships across human space, and his message was simple and clear. Within 2 days, the largest gathering of military force in human history began to take shape. The United Earth Fleet had been built mostly for defense and exploration, but every ship had been designed by people who remembered that humanity had fought wars for thousands of years before reaching space. Dreadnoughts that had been patrolling trade routes were recalled to Earth. Carriers that had been doing scientific missions received orders to load combat fighters and weapons. Every shipyard from Earth to the furthest colonies went to maximum production and started building more. Commander Lisa Grant was captain of the battleship UES Valiant, and she watched her crew as they learned why they were deploying early. These were professionals who had joined expecting to explore space and maybe chase a few pirates, but now they were preparing for total war. Her weapons officer, Lieutenant Ben Hughes, asked permission to run combat drills continuously, and she agreed immediately, because every bit of preparation might save lives when the fighting started. The diplomatic teams tried to stop things from getting worse. Ambassador Claire Mitchell led a group to the border with Zinthari Space and demanded that the Concordat release the survivors from Epsilon Prime and withdraw from human territory completely. High Archon Krelvax agreed to meet with her personally, and his scaled face showed what his people thought was a dismissive expression as he explained his position. He told Ambassador Mitchell that the Concordat had taken Epsilon Prime to establish clear boundaries in space, and that humanity could keep its other colonies if it accepted Zinthari supremacy in that region. The 63 survivors would be returned as a gesture of goodwill once Earth agreed to the terms he was offering. He seemed to think he was being generous by allowing humanity to keep most of its territory, and he acted like Earth should be grateful for his offer. Claire Mitchell stood up from the negotiating table and delivered humanity's response with perfect diplomatic precision. The Concordat had exactly 72 hours to withdraw completely from Epsilon Prime and return every single survivor unharmed to human custody. Any failure to comply would be considered an act of continued war. High Archon Krelvax made a rattling sound that was Zinthari laughter and dismissed the human delegation without taking the ultimatum seriously at all. Back on Earth, Admiral Kelly brought together all the fleet commanders to plan what would happen next. Admiral Nicole Bradford would lead the 2nd Battle Group. Admiral Victor Hayes had command of the 3rd. Commodore Paul Stevens brought the carrier group with all its fighters. Together they represented 412 warships, which was the entire accumulated military strength of 30 human worlds. The plan they made was not about conquering Zinthari space, but about making sure the Concordat understood that attacking humans carried a price too high to pay. Intelligence Officer Commander Matt Sullivan gave detailed briefings about Zinthari military power and how they fought. Their ships were powerful and their weapons were effective, but their tactics depended on having more force than their enemies. They had won 3 wars in recent centuries, and each time they had defeated younger civilizations by simply overwhelming them. They had never faced an enemy that could match their industrial capacity or that had studied war as deeply as humanity had done. The 72-hour deadline came and went. The Zinthri Concordat issued a statement saying that humanity's demands were unreasonable and threatening more military action if human ships entered Concordat space. High Archon Krelvax ordered more ships to Epsilon Prime because he wanted to show that the Concordat would not back down to what he called humanity's empty threats and dramatic posturing. Admiral Patrick Kelly received authorization from the Earth Council with a single word attached to the operational plan. The word was execute. The fleet began moving and ships started dropping into hyperspace in coordinated waves that had been planned down to the second. The destination was not Epsilon Prime, where the Zinthri expected humans to try to retake their colony. The destination was Zinthar itself, which was the homeworld of the Concordat and the heart of their empire. Humanity's message would be absolutely unmistakable, and the Zinthri would learn that if you struck human worlds, then humans would strike back at yours. The fleet moved through hyperspace toward Zinthar, and the journey would take 12 days. During that time, every ship prepared for what was coming. Crews ran drills and engineers optimized every system and weapons teams, practiced until they could hit targets in their sleep. The Zinthri had no idea what was heading toward them. They thought humanity was weak and young and would negotiate from fear. They were about to learn how wrong they were about the species that had climbed up from Earth. Intelligence reports about human fleet movements reached Concordat headquarters, but their analysts dismissed the activity as defensive preparations. Surely humans would not be foolish enough to attack Concordat territory directly. The Zinthri had more ships overall when their entire empire was counted. Humans were inexperienced in galactic warfare. Everything the Concordat knew suggested that Earth would back down and accept whatever terms were offered. High Archon Krelvax was already planning which human colony to target next to reinforce the lesson. He had no idea that a lesson was indeed coming, but he would be the one learning it. The journey through hyperspace to Zinthar would take 12 days, and Commander Lisa Grant used every hour of that time to make sure her crew aboard the UES Valiant was ready for combat. Chief Engineer Sam Collins worked around the clock making adjustments to get every bit of power from the reactor. Lieutenant Ben Hughes ran his gunnery crews through simulation after simulation until they could lock onto targets in under 3 seconds. Every person on every ship in the fleet knew what they were heading toward, and they prepared with grim determination. Admiral Kelly had planned the route carefully to avoid all the usual Zinthri patrol paths. The strategy depended on complete surprise, but not for the usual tactical reasons. The goal was to demonstrate to the Concordat how vulnerable they really were. If humanity could strike at their homeworld without warning, then no Zinthri colony anywhere was truly safe. The psychological impact of that realization would be just as important as any military damage. The fleet could inflict. Lieutenant Commander Rachel Stone commanded the scout wing that went ahead of the main fleet. Her stealth frigates were designed to avoid detection, and they mapped out all the Zinthri defensive positions around the home system. They counted every ship and monitored communication patterns and identified which targets were most important strategically. What Rachel found was both encouraging and sobering at the same time. The Zinthri home defense fleet was strong, but most of their military power was spread out across their huge empire protecting other worlds. Back on Earth, the families of everyone who had died at Epsilon Prime were given a chance to record messages. These recordings were loaded into the fleet communication systems not for broadcast, but as a reminder of exactly why 400 ships were crossing space toward an enemy homeworld. Captain LaVara Bennett had lost her brother in the attack, and her message was short and simple. She said, "We remember and we honor and we respond." Those words captured what everyone in the fleet was feeling. The Zinthri Concordat had no idea what was coming toward them. High Archon Krelvax stood before his council praising the conquest of Epsilon Prime as the first step in containing human expansion. Sub-Archon Threnkall sent reports from the captured colony saying the human survivors were cooperative and that new fortifications were being built. The Concordat leadership was already discussing which human colony they would target next to reinforce their dominance. They believed everything was going according to their plan. Some intelligence reports did reach Concordat military headquarters about increased human fleet movements, but the analysts looked at the data and dismissed it as defensive posturing. They reasoned that humanity would never be foolish enough to actually attack Concordat territory. The Zinthari had 3 times as many ships as humanity when all their forces were counted together. Humans were young and had little experience with galactic warfare. Everything suggested they would eventually negotiate and accept whatever terms the Concordat offered aboard the flagship UES Redemption. Admiral Patrick Kelly went over the final attack plan with his senior staff. The operation would start with long-range missiles hitting military installations around Zinthar. Then fighter squadrons would move in to neutralize the orbital defenses. The main battle fleet would engage whatever home defense forces responded. Any bombardment of the planet itself would be limited and precise, targeting only military and government buildings. Civilian areas would be avoided as much as possible. Commander Jack Preston was the fleet's chief tactical officer, and he raised the questions that everyone was thinking but not saying out loud. What they were about to do would kill thousands of Zinthari and possibly many more than that. Admiral Kelly acknowledged this fact without hesitation or uncertainty. Epsilon Prime had 247 civilians and 32 military personnel. 184 of them had been murdered. Humanity would demonstrate that such actions had consequences that no one could ignore. The chaplain aboard the Redemption was Lieutenant Commander Emma Wright, and she held services throughout the fleet as they traveled. She did not talk about righteousness or claim that what they were doing had divine blessing. Instead, she talked about responsibility. Those who chose to serve in the military accepted the burden of protecting people who could not protect themselves. Epsilon Prime had called for help. That help had arrived too late to save most of them. The fleet would make sure nothing like that ever happened again. On the 12th day, the fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Zinthar system. Sensors immediately detected 42 Zinthari warships arranged in defensive positions around their homeworld. The inner system was filled with civilian traffic, including cargo ships and passenger liners and orbital stations. It looked like a peaceful civilization going about its normal business, completely unaware that everything was about to change. Forever, Admiral Kelly gave the order, and the first missile salvos launched from 400 human ships simultaneously. The wave of missiles crossed the system faster than the Zinthari could react. Their sensors picked up the launches and alarms started screaming, but confusion was everywhere. Where had these missiles come from? How had human ships reached all the way to Zinthar without being detected? Officers were shouting questions and demanding answers, but there was no time because the missiles were already reaching their targets. Military orbital stations exploded in brilliant flashes of light. Ground-based defense installations vanished under precision strikes. The Zinthari had believed their homeworld was untouchable, and that belief died in the first few seconds. High Archon Krelvax was in the council chambers when the attack began, and through the windows he could see distant flashes in orbit. His communicator came alive with panicked reports from fleet commanders. The humans were here. They had come to Zinthar itself. He could not understand how this was possible or what it meant, but he was about to learn that humanity's capacity for strategic thinking and operational planning far exceeded anything the Concordat had imagined. The battle for Zinthar had begun, and the Concordat was about to receive the education they had foolishly sought to give humanity. The lesson would be harsh and unforgettable, and it would change the balance of power in the galaxy forever. The Zinthari home defense fleet scrambled to respond as sensors detected the human attack, but they were already behind and struggling to understand what was happening. 42 warships moved from their patrol positions, trying to form a defensive line between the attackers and their homeworld. Their commanders were shouting orders and demanding explanations, but nobody could answer the basic question of how humanity had managed to bring hundreds of ships to Zinthar without anyone detecting them until it was too late. Commander Lisa Grant stood on the bridge of the UES, valiant, watching the tactical display as the battle developed. The Zinthari were brave and their ships were well designed, but they were fighting an enemy that had evolved warfare over thousands of years. Human ships moved in coordinated patterns that the Zinthari had never seen before. Fighter wings exploited gaps in their formations. Electronic warfare blinded their sensors at critical moments. The home defense fleet found itself fighting a type of battle it was not prepared for. Admiral Patrick Kelly broadcast a message on all frequencies in the Zinthari language. His words were brief and clear. You attacked our colony and murdered our civilians, and you believed there would be no consequences. You were wrong. Withdraw all forces from Epsilon Prime immediately and release our people, or we will continue this engagement until your military capacity no longer exists. The message was heard on every ship and every station and across the entire planet below. High Archon Krelvax was in an emergency bunker now, and he listened to the human admiral's ultimatum with growing disbelief. This was not how things were supposed to happen. The Concordat was powerful and humans were supposed to be weak. They were supposed to negotiate from a position of fear. Instead, human warships were in orbit around Zinthar itself and Concordat ships were dying. He tried to rally more forces, calling for ships from nearby systems to converge on the Homeworld, but those ships were hours away and the battle was happening. Now. Admiral Nicole Bradford's battle group engaged the main Zinthari formation, and the fighting was intense. The Zinthari fought with desperate courage, knowing their families lived on the world below them. But courage alone was not enough against the coordinated assault that human forces delivered. Captain LeVar Bennett's fighter wing crippled 3 Zinthari cruisers in the first 15 minutes. Lieutenant Ben Hughes and his gunnery teams were achieving hit rates above 90%. Every shot counted, and every shot was finding its target. Commander Jack Preston coordinated the tactical assault from the flagship with cold precision. He had studied every piece of intelligence about how the Zinthari fought, and he knew their doctrine depended on overwhelming firepower against weaker opponents. But humanity was not weaker. Human ships had been designed by engineers who understood that space warfare required speed and coordination and precision. The Zinthari were fighting the kind of enemy they had never faced before, and they were learning the difference the hard way. The battle continued for 6 hours, and one by one the Zinthari ships were disabled or destroyed. Some exploded when their reactors were hit. Others lost power and went dark, drifting in orbit. A few managed to retreat to safer positions, but they were no longer capable of defending their world. Commodore Paul Stevens ordered his carriers to deploy rescue craft to recover Zinthari survivors even as the fighting continued. This gesture confused the Zinthari commanders, who could not understand why an enemy would save their lives. High Archon Krelvax watched the battle through satellite feeds and saw his fleet being systematically destroyed. He ordered additional defensive measures and called for civilian ships to evacuate key government officials. Admiral Kelly intercepted these communications and decided to send a message that could not be misunderstood. He ordered one ship forward. The dreadnought UES Reckoning moved into position above the massive government complex where the Concordat Council met when not in session. The main cannon of the Reckoning charged and fired once. A beam of coherent particles struck the government complex with the force of a nuclear weapon. The building that had stood for 600 years as a symbol of Zinthari power simply ceased to exist. The precision of the strike was its own message. Humanity could erase any target it chose. The complex was gone, but the buildings around it were barely touched. This was not random destruction. This was controlled application of overwhelming force. Admiral Kelly's voice came over all channels again, speaking in Zinthari so everyone would understand. This can end right now. Withdraw from Epsilon Prime and release our people. Or we will dismantle your military infrastructure piece by piece until you have nothing left. The choice is yours, but you need to make it quickly. Every minute you delay costs more Zinthari lives. The fleet held its position, waiting for a response. The Concordat Council met in an emergency bunker deep underground. Krelvax sat at the table, looking at the faces of the other council members and seeing fear and anger directed at him. His certainty had brought this disaster. His belief that humans were weak had led to Zinther burning in orbit. One of the council members demanded his immediate arrest. Another called for immediate surrender to human demands. The debate was brief because another orbital strike hit a military shipyard and there was no more time for discussion. Archon Velshara took control of the council and opened a communication channel to the human fleet. She stated that the Concordat agreed to all human demands. Forces would withdraw from Epsilon Prime immediately. All human survivors would be released unharmed. The Concordat requested a ceasefire and asked to begin negotiations for a formal peace. Her voice was steady, but everyone listening could hear the defeat in it. Admiral Kelly accepted the ceasefire and ordered all human ships to hold their positions. The shooting stopped, but the fleet remained in orbit around Zinther as a reminder of what had happened here. Sub-Archon Threncall at Epsilon Prime received his orders and began loading his troops onto transports. The survivors, including Jake Morrison and Amy Peterson, watched as their captors left and human ships appeared in the sky above them. After 4 months of captivity and uncertainty, they were finally going home. The battle for Zinther was over, but its effects would ripple across the galaxy for decades to come. The Concordat had learned that humanity would cross any distance and pay any price to answer an attack on their people. Other civilizations watched and learned that same lesson. Humanity preferred peace, but if forced to war, they would fight with everything they had and everything they were. The age of testing humanity's resolve was over before it had truly begun. Admiral Patrick Kelly ordered the fleet to remain at Zinther for exactly 72 hours after the ceasefire, which was the same deadline humanity had originally given the Concordat. During those 3 days, human engineering crews helped with damage control on disabled Zintheri ships. Medical teams treated wounded enemy personnel. The Zintheri population watched these actions with growing confusion because this was not how they expected conquerors to behave. They had come expecting humans to be barbaric in victory, but instead saw mercy and professionalism. Subarchon Threncall supervised the withdrawal from Epsilon Prime, and he worked quickly because he understood that his own survival depended on following orders exactly. The Zintheri troops loaded their equipment and weapons onto transports and lifted off, leaving the colony behind. Jake Morrison stood with Amy Peterson and the other 61 survivors watching the enemy ships depart. They had endured 4 months of captivity, never knowing if rescue would come. Now, as human ships filled the sky above them, many of the survivors wept with relief and joy. Commander Lisa Grant met with captured Zintheri officers aboard the U.S. Valiant to explain why humanity had responded as it did. One Zintheri captain asked a question that was being whispered across their entire homeworld. Why had humans not simply destroyed Zinther when they had the opportunity and the firepower to do it? Lisa's answer was direct and simple. Because we are not you. We fight when we must, but we do not murder without cause. We came to teach a lesson, not to commit genocide. The Zintheri officers listened and began to understand they had badly misjudged the species they had attacked. The strategic situation across the galaxy shifted immediately. The Concordat, which had seemed so powerful, was revealed as vulnerable. Member species that had been forced into the Concordat began questioning whether they wanted to remain part of an empire that had been humiliated so completely. High Archon Kralvax was arrested by his own council and charged with gross negligence in leading the Concordat into disaster. Archon Velshara, who replaced him, immediately opened diplomatic channels with Earth. Ambassador Claire Mitchell returned to Concordat space, but this time she came to negotiate peace, not to deliver ultimatums. The terms she presented were harsh but not designed to destroy Zintheri civilization. The Concordat would recognize all human territorial claims. They would pay reparations for the damage at Epsilon Prime. They would submit to mutual defense inspections to prevent future conflicts. The Zintheri, who had expected their civilization to be dismantled or occupied, agreed to every single condition without argument. On Earth, the returning fleet was greeted with both celebration and solemn remembrance. Parades honored the military personnel who had executed the operation at Zinther. but memorial services were held for Captain Helen Vance and Lieutenant Danny Cruz and Commander Greg Phillips and all the others who had died at Epsilon Prime. They were recognized not just as casualties of war, but as citizens whose deaths had demanded and received justice. Their names were carved into a memorial that would stand for generations. Jake Morrison was promoted to commander and given command of the rebuilt garrison at Epsilon Prime. He requested Amy Peterson as his second in command, and the request was immediately approved. Together they oversaw the colony's reconstruction as families returned and mining operations resumed. The settlement bore scars from the attack, but it was alive and growing again. New defenses were installed that would ensure nothing like the Zinthri attack could succeed again. Admiral Patrick Kelly retired from active service 6 months after the Zinther operation. His final act before leaving command was establishing the Epsilon Prime Foundation, dedicated to supporting frontier settlements. The Foundation's emblem showed 247 stars representing each person who had been at the colony when the attack came. The Foundation worked to ensure that no human settlement would ever again face threats without adequate defense and support. The Zinthri Concordat slowly rebuilt under Archon Velshara's leadership. She understood that her people's survival depended on adapting to the new reality of galactic politics. She worked to reform Concordat culture away from domination and toward cooperation. Younger Zinthri, especially those who had witnessed humanity's restraint in victory, began advocating for partnership with other species rather than conquest. The change was slow, but it was real. Lieutenant Commander Rachel Stone received the Fleet Star for her Scout Wings work during the operation. When journalists asked what the campaign had taught her about humanity, she gave an answer that was repeated across human space and beyond. We prefer peace. We build and explore and create. But if you force us to war, we will fight with everything we have and everything we are. Those words became something of an unofficial motto for human military forces. 10 years after the attack on Epsilon Prime, Commander Jake Morrison attended a ceremony marking the colony's complete recovery. The settlement now housed 400 people protected by modern defenses and a rotating naval presence that ensured no one would catch them unprepared again. Children who had been born after the attack played in the rebuilt plaza. Jake watched them and thought about the price that had been paid and the message humanity had sent to the galaxy. Other civilizations had watched what happened at Zinther and learned from it. Species that might have tested humanity's resolve decided that peaceful contact was a better choice. The galaxy had seen that humans would extend friendship to those who wanted peace, but would respond to violence with overwhelming force. Trade agreements were signed. Cultural exchanges began. Scientific cooperation flourished. The frontier became safer not through fear, but through mutual understanding backed by demonstrated capability. Ambassador Claire Mitchell continued her diplomatic work-building relationships with species across the galaxy. She found that humanity's response to the Epsilon Prime attack had given human diplomacy a weight it had not possessed before. When she spoke, other species listened because they knew that human promises and human warnings both carried absolute commitment behind them. Peace was always preferred, but the option of war was never empty talk. The survivors of Epsilon Prime scattered across human space, but they stayed in contact with each other. Once a year they gathered at the memorial where the names of the dead were carved in stone. They shared memories and honored those who had not survived. They also celebrated the fact that their ordeal had led to a stronger and more secure humanity. The attack had been meant to weaken human resolve, but instead it had revealed the steel that lay beneath humanity's peaceful exterior. Commander Lisa Grant eventually became Admiral Grant and took command of frontier defense operations. She made it her mission to ensure that every human settlement, no matter how small or remote, had the means to defend itself and call for help. The lessons of Epsilon Prime were incorporated into military doctrine and defensive planning. Never again would humans be caught so unprepared. Never again would an attack on human civilians go unanswered. The galaxy learned what the Zinthri discovered at such terrible cost. Humanity was not weak or naive or safe to attack. The species that had climbed from Earth carried both the hope of peaceful exploration and the strength of a warrior past. They would offer friendship to any who wished it, but those who chose violence would face consequences that crossed stars and shattered worlds. In the cold mathematics of galactic politics, everyone now understood that humanity remembered its dead and honored its fallen and answered every attack with overwhelming resolve that neither distance nor difficulty could diminish.